Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends of the International Crisis Group, good afternoon and thank you for having joined us today. My name is Giuseppe Famai and I coordinate the European Union work for the International Crisis Group. I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the launch of our 2021 watch list. This event is part of our EU watch list series, which is the set of activities that Crisis Group tailors to look at the role of the EU and its member states in conflict prevention, crisis management, and conflict resolution. For those who are not familiar with our EU watch list or even Crisis Group, let me give you a brief reminder of who we are. Crisis Group is an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that can build sustained peace. Our mandate is to engage with all parties and support efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve deadly conflict. We do so by sounding the alarm bell, providing independent, field-based, and high-quality analysis, and engaging directly with conflict actors and key international players, like many of you connected today are, to encourage informed and intelligent action for peace. So we're very glad to host this discussion with such a diverse array of participants from the EU policy world and civil society. Let me immediately acknowledge the participation of so many colleagues who are connecting with us, including EU special representatives, heads of EU delegations around the globe, including from Tripoli, Baku, and Pristina, and members of the European Parliament from all political groups. They join us with plenty more colleagues from non-governmental and civil society organizations, together with diplomats from the member states and many colleagues from the Commission and the External Action Service. I gather we have more than 300 registrations in this call and 200 more signed up via our YouTube live streaming. We're really humbled by your participation and sincerely thank you for having made the time to be with us, especially during this challenging moment. And indeed, it is worth noting the very time we are in as this conversation takes place. First, we are not yet close to roll back the COVID pandemic. Yet, as the crisis keeps dragging, the secondary impact of the pandemic becomes more evident, including in conflict. Therefore, questions on how to manage the dreary economic and humanitarian legacy of the virus have become even more evident and concerning. Second, our conversations take place soon after a new administration was sworn in the United States. The arrival of President Biden offers opportunities for a reset, with the prospect for a return to a more multilateral diplomacy and closer cooperation with Europe. And certainly bringing a relief for those European leaders who had to calculate the cost of potentially crossing wires with former President Trump, including for their interventions in complex situations. Third, 2021 marks the 10th birthday of the European External Action Service, the EU's diplomatic service, and the Commission's for Foreign Policy Instruments, which is the main conflict prevention and peace building arm in the Commission. Behind the symbolic date, there is a lively debate for the EU role in peace and security matters. And in parallel, Brussels is also about to plan much of its external aid for the years to come. So today's conversation comes at a very timely moment. In this context, we look at the role of European players as they have become more relevant in the field of conflict prevention and can have a decisive role in some crises. And the Watch List 2021 that we will discuss today does that, presenting the 10 crises and conflict situations where we believe the EU and its member states can play such a positive role. Our colleagues from regional programs in the field and the staff from our policy centers put together the detailed conflict analysis and recommendations targeted to EU actors in 4 African conflicts, namely the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Somalia, Nagorno-Karabakh in the South Caucasus, then Iran and the Arab Gulf, Libya, Thailand, Venezuela, and finally Mexico and Central America. We will look at them during the second panel, making a deeper dive into our recommendations with our regional program directors and colleagues from the European Union. Let me note that this work is possible thanks to the support of the European Commission, their Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, and the very close collaboration that we have with the European External Action Service, and particularly their Integrated Security and Peace Directorate. And this leads me to the first guest of the day, who I'm very pleased to introduce. Please join me in welcoming Hilde Hardeman, the Director and Head of the European Commission Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. She heads the Foreign Policy Instruments since 2017, advancing the work of more than 200 colleagues in Brussels and European delegations around the world. Hilde worked 25 years for the Commission on External Relations and on economic and market issues, including as Deputy Head of Cabinet to the Commission Vice President and as coordinator at the President's of the Commission Office for its meetings with EU heads of states and government. And finally, also as Head of EU relations with Russia and Eastern Europe. Hilde, thank you very much for having joined us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Dear friends from Crisis Group, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's really my pleasure to welcome you to the presentation of the Crisis Group's EU Watch List 2021. Now, this yearly event has become something we all look forward to, an invaluable opportunity to compare notes, to exchange analysis on situations in conflict or at risk of conflict, and what the EU can do to help foster peace. Today's event was one we had intended to share with Rob Malley, Crisis Group's year-long president. But Rob moved last week from analysis to action following his appointment as US envoy for Iran. And it's excellent to see Rob, who has dedicated much of his professional life to understanding conflict dynamics and advising on how to avoid conflict or end conflict, in charge of such a delicate task. Rob informed us right after his appointment, and I will be honest, however much I regret to see him go, I was delighted to get his news. So my congratulations to Rob and to Crisis Group, and I look forward to continuing the excellent cooperation with you, Richard. Very best wishes to you. And now, what brings us together today? Crisis Group's annual EU watch list. Our thanks to International Crisis Group, the colleagues in Brussels and across the world, for yet another piece of top quality analysis. The Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, which I lead, and the International Crisis Group have a long-standing relationship. We have been working together since 2013, and I can honestly say that your briefings, reports, and workshops are crucial sources for our reflection and for our action. Your analyses bring out the granularities and complexities of conflict dynamics with facts and arguments, and that's very important, with extreme respect for the human suffering and tragedies that conflicts inevitably bring about. Conflict analysis and conflict prevention are a crucial aspect of the EU's work as a global actor. To better understand conflict dynamics, to see warning signs of potential conflict, to reflect on what to do and what not to do, and how to do what we want to do. All these steps are essential to have an impact. It's good to see how over the past years, conflict analysis has become more and more part of the way we do business in the EU. And the work of Crisis Group has certainly contributed to making this happen. Our new instrument for international cooperation, the Neighbourhood, Development and International Cooperation Instrument, that also takes over from our long-standing instrument contributing to stability and peace. Well, this new instrument gives a particular role to conflict analysis, which is now a requirement for EU programming in all fragile countries and contexts. And under our new instrument, peace building and conflict sensitivity are components of all programs, whether they're geographic and thematic. And I am sure that the work we have done with International Crisis Group, in cooperation with our colleagues of the European External Action Service and the other Commission services here in Brussels and across the globe, has contributed greatly to creating a culture of conflict analysis, conflict sensitivity, and conflict prevention throughout the EU institutions. Now, this year's EU watch list mentions old crisis and new crisis. Crisis that might be forgotten by many, and crisis we consider almost on a daily basis. We will have the opportunity to discuss these in more detail in a moment. To conclude, let me say once more how important your work is for our action and how crucial your analysis is in building an EU response to conflict or the threat of conflict. Again, thank you. Congratulations on an excellent piece of work. Thank you for the excellent cooperation and looking forward to our discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Giuseppe.
Thank you very much, Hilde, for the kind words and for your support and cooperation. Indeed, we share your commitment to help the EU attain, as you said, a culture of conflict prevention and early action, which is among our key goals. And let me also pay tribute to our colleagues from the EAS Integrated Security and Peace Directorate, who are also here today and with whom we also rub elbows in the same effort. Before leaving the virtual stage, let me acknowledge the essential contribution of all of Crisis Group's field analysts and colleagues who are behind this work, starting from our dynamic staff in Brussels, which drives our engagement with the EU. And we could be no more pleased to see this engagement in practice today as we prepare to welcome the new Secretary General of the EAS, Mr. Stefano Sannino. We're very glad and honored to welcome for a conversation with our interim President, Richard Atwood. Then let me leave the floor to Elissa Jobson, Crisis Group's Director for Global Advocacy, who will moderate their panel. Thank you all again for your participation. We hope that today's exchange will improve the quality of our actions and shape real impact to improve the conditions of all those affected by conflict. Elissa, over to you.
Thanks, Giuseppe. And thanks everyone joining us today, both on Zoom and live on YouTube. We're actually waiting for one of our guests to arrive today, Stefano Sannino. I don't believe he's on the call just yet, but I'll introduce the other panelists that we have today, which is my colleague, Richard Atwood, who, as Hilde Hardeman just said, is currently Crisis Group's interim president and CEO. He's just assumed this new role following the resignation of Robert Malley, who's joined the Biden administration as Iran envoy. Richard has been with Crisis Group for over a decade and was previously our chief of policy. So a warm welcome to you, Richard. Just checking to see if Mr. Sannino is on the call yet. I don't see him just yet. Anyway, I'll tell you what we've got planned in this first session. Today, we're hopefully going to be looking at global trends, conflicts and prospects for peace in conversation with Mr. Sannino and Richard Atwood, in which we'll touch on some of the key issues of the day, particularly looking at the COVID pandemic and also what the new US administration means for the EU and also for conflict prevention and resolution. So, as I said, we're going to start off with a short conversation between Mr. Sannino and Richard, and this will be followed by a Q&A in which I'll take questions from the floor. If you have a question, please write it in the Q&A facility on Zoom or in the comment box if you are joining us on YouTube. Please note that on Zoom, we'll be using the vote up function, which allows the audience to vote for their preferred questions. So there's a couple of housekeeping points that I'd also like to mention. The event today, both panels are on the record and the event is being recorded and, as I said, live streamed on YouTube. I have a request also, which is at the end of today's event, if you could kindly fill out the evaluation questionnaire that you'll receive, as this allows us to improve our future events. Just going to check if Mr. Sannino is on. He's going to be a couple of minutes, I understand. So I'll introduce him in his absence, and then maybe I'll give Richard the first question whilst we're waiting for Mr. Sannino. So as Giuseppe said, today we should have with us Stefano Sannino, the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, a post that he's held since the start of the year. He's worked for 25 years in the Italian government and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as at the EU and the OSCE. Before becoming Secretary General, he was the EAS's Deputy Secretary General for Economic and Global Affairs, covering Africa, multilateral institutions, human rights, and thematic issues. So, as I said, I think I'll start with a first question to Richard. which is in March 2020, as COVID was beginning to spread quickly across the globe, a crisis group published a report analysing the potential impact of the pandemic on conflicts and crises. In it, we raised the possibility of further destabilisation of fragile countries, immense humanitarian fallout resulting from economic shutdowns, and the distraction, if not paralysis, of international multilateral diplomacy. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, how this played out. These risks don't seem to have been as great as we feared, and also what impact did the pandemic have on conflict in 2020, and how do you think its effects will be felt in 2021? Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and really, first of all, let me say really welcome to everyone for joining. Thanks so much for joining us. I know we have as Giuseppe said, a lot of EU officials, a lot of people from civil society and other officials joining us. So thank you. We really value this exchange. Please do feel free to ask questions, to post questions, and this is really an annual event of ours that we look forward to, and the exchange we always find useful. So, listen, I mean the question of the international, or the implications for international peace and security of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's a difficult question, but I think we could say we're still waiting to see in some ways. Obviously, the pandemic has inflicted enormous damage on millions of lives, upended millions of livelihoods. It's impacted so much of the world, so much of our own lives. And it's really changed, a lot about the way the world worked in 2020. On the other hand, in some ways, it's striking that in some of the world's major conflicts, the world's worst crises, it hasn't as yet really changed conflict dynamics. The warring parties in some of the world's worst crises, if you look across them, many of them are on the watch list. They haven't really seen reason to stop fighting each other to fight the pandemic. And, in some ways, that's not surprising. The reasons they're fighting are often quite deep-seated. Some of these wars have been going on for a long time. But conflict dynamics in some of the world's worst crises haven't really changed as much as might have been anticipated. And it's not that the pandemic hasn't hit some of those countries quite hard. I mean, if you think of the way that COVID-19 has hit crises, for example, in Yemen, in parts of Afghanistan and parts of Syria, clearly people have suffered from the pandemic, but the fighting dynamics themselves haven't changed so much. Now, clearly the pandemic, because it's been so pervasive, it has played into the context in which conflicts are taking place. So if you think, for example, of some of the decisions that governments have had to make, whether it's lockdowns, whether it's delaying elections, whether it's putting other aspects of politics on hold. These, in some places, have played into political instability. They've changed relations between governments and opposition. You just think of one example, for example, the election delays in Ethiopia, where the government pushed back elections, understandably, because of the pandemic. That election delay was one of the triggers of this terrible conflict that's ongoing in Tigray that we'll talk about in the next session. But the conflict in Tigray is, again, it's not about the government's handling of COVID. It's just that a government decision related to COVID, played into an existing dispute between Addis Ababa and the Tigray government. And so it played into the conflict dynamics, but in some ways it didn't actually change them so much, and certainly didn't cause the conflict. I think you could perhaps argue that with attention in Western capitals at the United Nations consumed by COVID, there's been less attention to international peacemaking efforts. Perhaps in some cases, leaders have seen opportunities to crack down on their opponents or to pursue some of their goals with force. I think maybe that's the case in some places, but you're sort of looking at a counterfactual. You're arguing there, well, that wouldn't have happened had it not been for COVID, and I think it's sometimes quite difficult to say. So I think the overall implications for international peace and security of the past year, I think we're still in some ways still waiting to see them. And it is early days. Of course, the economic downturn, we know that a lot of that is still to come. And we don't know yet what the implications of that will be. We put out a conflict alert, a statement today on protests in Tripoli in Lebanon. And these were provoked by a government lockdown. They were in response to a government lockdown, which itself was provoked by the pandemic. Now, of course, those come on top of a lot of other grievances in Lebanon. The lack of jobs, anger at elites, the Beirut explosions. But they've compounded those. They've compounded popular anger. And I think, obviously the Lebanon situation is peculiar, it's particular to Lebanon. But it's easy to see that in countries where there's already social contracts fraying, where lifting of subsidies or lack of jobs or lack of opportunities for young people were already challenges, it's easy to see how the economic downturn is going to be tough for countries like that. And I think, it's also worth saying that the full political impact of the 2008 financial crisis didn't really materialize for some years. It wasn't until some years after the crisis and the response to the crisis that sort of we saw this resurgence of populism in parts of Europe, in the US. That took years to come. So I think it's fair to say that even if the international or the implications for international peace and security so far from the past year are not quite clear, there's a lot still to play out, and there's a lot still to be concerned about.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And I see Mr. Sanino has joined us. Welcome. So we've just been discussing the impact that COVID has had on conflict in 2020 and what its impact might be in 2021. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Sanino, as the EU grapples with its own internal response to COVID-19, how has the pandemic affected the EU's response to conflict and crises around the world? Thank you.
Thank you. No, and first of all, apologies. I have a little bit of mismatch with the computer and the login and the connections. Well, first of all, maybe to say that I think that the COVID-19 crisis has generated, I would say, an acceleration of all the trends that we were already looking before. And this, unfortunately, has applied also to conflicts. A way I would say that contrary to what one could have expected, crises have gone on, and those who were existing have become somehow even more complicated, and new ones have started to erupt. The difficulties that a number of countries were already facing have been worsened by the social, the economic crisis, which has aggravated the situation. And so we have been faced with a world which was, generally speaking, more difficult, more complex, and more fragmented than before. On the top of that, you need to add, let's say, the attention that the governments have given to the crisis, and so much of their energies has been devoted to management, the health, and then also the economic consequences of the health crisis. And finally, I mean, the geopolitical situation in the last few years have generated an even further polarization in terms of political relations. And this has been a factor that has aggravated further the situation. So all in all, I would say that this has been a very, very difficult year where it would have maybe it needed more of our attention and of our concentration. And on the contrary, we have been, our attention has been diverted much more internally, and we have been much more inward looking compared with what it should have been.
And I mean, you mentioned there that there's been a more internal focus. And I think we're looking at potentially the economic fallout from the pandemic playing out this year and probably into the next few years. I just wondered if you could tell us, how is the European Union supporting fragile states that are facing the economic fallouts of the pandemic?
Well, this is, as a matter of fact, is the one of the things that maybe we have managed to do, in the sense that while we were taking ourselves a sort of much more concerted approach in terms of how the 27 have been able to face the challenges of the health and of the economic crisis, we have also very rapidly realized that especially our neighbors, but the many other fragile countries in general, were suffering a lot from this situation. And we have tried to join forces. So we have come up with this idea of this concept of Team Europe, where essentially member states, institutions, but also banks of the different, let's say, development banks of the different member states, were joining forces in order to make a greater impact on the ground. This has allowed to make a sort of redefinition of our assistance. So we have rapidly, let's say, redirected funds that were they'd already been allocated for these countries into projects that could support the health situation or create fiscal space for countries to face the consequences. And this has generated a quite substantial, let's say, economic and financial impact. And the other thing, the other initiative that we have also taken collectively, is how to alleviate the burden of the external debt of many countries. We have certainly managed to find an agreement on the service of the debt, but as a matter of fact, there has been also a much broader reflection on how we could come in order to alleviate this debt, to make it more manageable, more sustainable in the future, and just to avoid that then in 6 or 12 months' time, more fragile countries could find themselves in a difficult situation. So I would say these have been the two main fronts on which we have worked collectively. Once again, I think that in a way it's strange to put it so emphatically, because it's how it should work, but putting together everybody and join forces is not always an easy exercise.
No, and I think what COVID has, I think, shown us how small the world is and how important collective action and cooperation is. I'd like to sort of shift away from COVID now, and we see a new administration in the US, and there's lots of hopes about what President Joe Biden can do. Also, I think I hope that the relationship between Europe and America will improve under Joe Biden. It's been tested, I think, under President Trump. And Europeans were very quick to signal that they wanted to rekindle the transatlantic partnership. Could you tell us maybe what you expect this renewed cooperation to look like in practice? And do you think that there will be some scars that the EU and the US will find it difficult to heal? Thanks.
I hope not about scars. I hope that it's not going to be too complicated. At the end of the day, I think that the reaction from the European Union, from the member state, has been very clear in terms of willing to re-engage very rapidly, to recommit very rapidly. I think that on the contrary, in a way, we need to manage expectations because the change of administration does not mean that all of a sudden we see everything in eye to eye, and that on everything we agree. There are areas on which there are, let's say, not long-standing disagreement. I'm thinking in particular to the trade aspects, for example. The trade issues is always something that, and it is normal in a way, and between two blocks which are also competing economically, that there are frictions and tensions, and this will remain over time. I mean, I suppose that not necessarily in all foreign policy issues we will have the same kind of approach and the same kind of impact. But I think that one basic substantial change is that essentially the method will be an agreed method. I mean, it's not only in, let's say, in the context of the multilateral system, which is also another important part. And I think that the first moves from the US administration have been very relevant from that point of view, re-entering the Paris Agreement, re-entering the WHO. So have been clear signals of a recommitment, a re-engagement of the US in the multilateral sphere, but also bilaterally. The idea is how we can manage, even to manage our disagreement, which is the most important thing, and that the world hopefully will not just be black and white, I mean, with me or against me. I mean, that there will be a space for nuances, there will be space for a different way of doing things, and for dialogue, and for the possibility of understanding each other and each other's position. I think that that's how to say, the substantive change that it's already there, because this has been also all the first steps and all the first indications that have come from the new administration are going in that direction.
Thank you. And Richard, I wondered perhaps if you could tell us areas where you think the EU and the US should prioritize joint action in peace and security.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I thought Mr. Sannino said it very well. You know, in many ways, Europe has been on a particularly sharp end of the past 4 years, with President Trump sort of openly questioning alliances, not always consulting European partners, in some ways disregarding their interests. So, you know, inevitably, there's I think a lot of enthusiasm in Europe for a new US administration, and broadly speaking, lots of opportunities for Europe to work together. The climate crisis, efforts to tackle the climate crisis is obviously a big one. I think we'd like to see Europe and the US work together to try to reinvigorate the Security Council's crisis management. We've detailed some of the ways that might be possible. We'd like to see the US more involved again in international peacemaking, whether that's in Libya, whether it's in Yemen, greater US support behind some of the UN's efforts, behind the efforts of others to end wars, to mitigate some of the suffering they cause. I think we could, we highlight a couple in our watch list. So two in particular. Obviously, one big one is the Iran nuclear deal and the relations between Europe, the US, and Iran, and really there the maximum pressure strategy adopted by the Trump administration, sanctions, moving out of the JCPOA. Overall, that's been a failure. It's led Iran to accelerate its nuclear program. It's created instability across the region. It's led Iran to have more ballistic missiles, more powerful ballistic missiles. So I think we would like to see, the US administration returns to JCPOA, and Europe encourage that. And then once they've gone back to the JCPOA, build on that, ideally in a way to address some of the other concerns, whether it's ballistic missiles or Iran's power projection across the region. Now, that's not going to be easy. The US and Iran are going to have to reach agreement on how to sequence sanctions lifting, with Iran's steps on nuclear compliance. They don't have long. Iranian elections are in June, and they could result in a harder line president taking power. And even then, the US is going to have to manage some of the concerns of Saudi Arabia, of Israel, that are worried about Iran's role in the region. But I think we would see a real priority for Europe in helping the US get back to the JCPOA as fast as possible. And there's a number of things they could do in support of that. Encourage trade between Europe and Iran, humanitarian support to Iran in response to the pandemic. Maybe also think through ways of encouraging diplomacy between Tehran and Riyadh, as things move forward with the US-Iran negotiations. So that's one place. I think the other one where there's some parallels is on Venezuela, where again the US adopted this sort of maximum pressure strategy, which I think also failed. These very tough sanctions against Venezuela, diplomatic pressure, even this abortive of coup, have actually left President Maduro in a stronger position than ever. The strategy aimed to oust him, and he's looking stronger than he's been for some time. Now, the grave humanitarian situation in Venezuela, the economic collapse, that's largely on the government. I mean, that's largely due to government mismanagement. But Maduro has been able to portray that as a result of sanctions. And some of the opposition leaders have lost support in the country because of their support of sanctions. So I think there we would look to Europe to encourage the US to review its sanctions policy, look at the humanitarian cost of some of the sanctions, and then collectively work out what a new approach looks like. An approach that is not necessarily rooted in backing one opposition politician and getting rid of Maduro, but an approach that's not so zero-sum. In the end, the solution to the crisis in Venezuela is a credible election, which means the government accepting reform and the opposition insisting, at least initially, that Maduro himself doesn't step down. It certainly requires working with Cuba, Russia, and China. So I think there are opportunities to work with the US for a fresh approach. I think broadly, as Mr. Sanino said, broadly the challenge with the US will be working as much as possible together, but also for Europe moving its own discussions of strategic autonomy forward. Obviously, President Biden won resoundingly, but still many people voted for Trump. Still, there's a big constituency that supports at least some of what President Trump stood for. It's easily possible that in 4 years' time, somebody like him, somebody skeptical about alliances, somebody skeptical about the relationship with Europe, somebody skeptical about multilateralism, it's easily possible that in 4 years' time, someone like him will come back. And the challenge, I think the overarching challenge for Europe will be to work as much as possible with the Biden administration over these 4 years, while still preparing for that eventuality.
Thanks, Richard. And just to sort of follow up on that, I mean, obviously the images of the assault on the US Capitol were received with shock and dismay around the world. And, I think President Trump's attempt to overturn the election results were straight out of the autocrat's playbook. And, given this, and given that many conflicts and crises around the world originate from election and military election disputes and also military coups like the one we've just seen this week in Myanmar, what did the events that played out in DC earlier this year mean for US credibility in international crisis diplomacy and also intervention in conflict? And do you think this opens up space for other actors like the EU?
Look,
sorry, Mr. Sinin, please go ahead.
No, sorry, it's the you start and then I can continue, no problem.
Okay, and now I'm interested in your response. But
okay. Then I'll move forward. I'll do. I think that first of all, let me go back to one of the things that Richard was saying, and I think that it's very relevant about the strategic autonomy, because I think it's something that it's relevant in the debate within the European Union, but it's relevant also in our discussion with the new administration, and where I think we need to work very rapidly together. The idea is really, and now I don't want to say because we can have a different kind of administration tomorrow, but I think that in a partnership, especially in a strong partnership, in a privileged partnership like the one that we have between the European Union and the United States, it is essential that the two sides are equally strong. that it's a strong partnership does not mean one strong partner and a weak one. A strong partnership means that the two can, let's say, intervene credibly in different areas, in different sectors. I think that, I would say, in a way, the debate has been charged a little bit too much emotionally, and I would say ideologically. And once again, it's in this sort of black and white. So, I mean, you can, if you are my partner, then you have to say whatever I say or whatever I do. That's not the point. The point is how we can manage when we are facing crisis, when we are facing difficult situations, how we can manage to bring our weight together in order to get a change. And I think that Richard was very right when he was speaking about a number of crises. The crises are not solved only by putting maximum pressure, because at the end of the day, if I want to go to the end of my line of reasoning and maybe going too far, the only thing that you can do then is get a military intervention. It's the because then if you that's the maximum pressure that you can put. But we cannot, I would say, go everywhere in the world militarily. So, I mean, in a way, we need to be able to engage the parties to find solutions into the area of what can be done together. The world is complex and needs to be managed. And that's the complexity of the work that we are all doing. So, I mean, strong partnership means also this, and European Union has tried to develop, I would say, its raison d'etre, right? The fact itself of being ourselves is the fact of becoming stronger, of becoming more credible, of becoming more able to intervene. I don't think that nobody was saying having problems in the European Union becoming a strong commercial partner when we were developing our commercial policy, or when we were developing our euro. And the euro is certainly a very important sign of strategic autonomy from many points of view. And I could continue, and there are so many examples and so many areas in which we are working in order simply to, let's say, become less fragile, less exposed, because being together and pulling together our forces and our energies as member states of the European Union, we can be stronger on the international scene. So, I mean, for me, it's not that because the United States have had the problem during a period, this is opening a space for the European Union. Honestly, it's not the approach that we should take. I mean, I'm not glad. I'm not happy when I saw what I saw happening in the capital. I was not rejoicing of this. On the contrary, I was very saddened, and my reflection the morning after was that I felt that we were all more fragile, more exposed, somehow less strong collectively. And that's the point that we need to, I think that we need to assume, and I hope that we assume, is that if both we are stronger, it's much better. So it's not that weakness of the other makes our life easier for the other side. So I want a strong United States, I want a strong Europe, I want a very strong partnership between the two, and us together being able to influence more process in the world, exactly because in a way we share the same vision, we have the same, I know that the word is abused, but the same set of values. And I mean, we are open societies, democracies. We believe in a number of, believe in human rights and in the divisibility of the human rights. And that's what we are trying to affirm in the world.
I mean, yeah, Stefano said it very well. I mean, I agree with that completely. I mean, I think if you look at the crises on our list for the EU, it's clear how much stronger efforts to end them are when Europe and the US can work together. That's clear. I mean, it's a force multiplier. I mean, that's clearly the case. I think the difficulty, of course, is that now for the next 4 years, there will be this opportunity, and Europe should do what it can to work with the Biden administration, but it also needs to prepare for a time when there might be a US administration that is less outward facing, that is less supportive of working together to end conflicts. And I think then it's not so much that there are opportunities for the European Union. I think then there will be a greater necessity for Europe, as there has been over the past few years, to step in. And you know, we've seen Europe in a number of places try to step in where the policies of the US administration haven't been helpful, whether this is on trying to keep the JCPOA alive, whether it's been trying to keep you know, humanitarian support going to the Palestinians. So a whole number of places where Europe has sort of been forced to step up over the past few years. I think your question on whether the assault on the Capitol undercut US credibility in conflict prevention, it's a great question. Of course, it's not just the assault on the Capitol, it's also some of the other things that President Trump did when he was in office, is sort of questioning of democratic institutions. You know, I don't think people expect across the world for the US to be, you know, entirely consistent in its promotion of values. But it is quite different to have someone in the White House who's sort of openly admiring the powers that dictators across the world enjoy. So in that sense, I think he was clearly a departure, and you know, in some ways he's done some damage to US credibility. The fact that the institutions in the US survived, you know, quite a vigorous assault by him and his team against them, I think shows to some degree their resilience. But obviously, you know, some of the things he did are damaging to US credibility. I would say, you know, I think the link between US credibility and conflict prevention is sometimes quite a difficult one. You know, in the end, if the US wants to make something happen, working with Europe, working with others, if it wants to persuade an ally to do something, persuade an ally to release political prisoners or not beat up on the opposition, or, you know, to curb its nuclear program or other things, you know, I think its credibility matters, but it also matters how much energy it's prepared to put into doing that, how much political capital it's prepared to invest in doing that. So power in some ways is, and power and how much of a political priority something is, it can be as important as credibility. I think I'd also say that, you know, where US credibility already over the last, you know, clearly the US is absolutely essential. The more that Europe and the US can work together on conflict management, the better. I would say that, you know, in some ways, US credibility in conflict prevention has taken some hits since the over the past couple of decades. Obviously, there's the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's what happened in South Sudan to some degree, in Libya, in Syria. You know, in some ways, Trump sounded very different, and he's done some things very, very differently, stepping out of deals, stepping out of international commitments. Of course, this is terrible for US credibility. But in other ways, you know, I think in some ways, in parts of the world, US credibility was already eroding, and in some ways, President Trump was a continuation of trends that were already underway.
Thanks, Richard. So we've got a few questions now that have come in from the audience. And as I said before, if you do have a question, if you're on Zoom, please do type it into the Q&A. And we're exercising democracy here by having the vote up function, and you know, the most popular questions will get answered. And also for anyone on YouTube, if you do have a question, please put that in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get to it. So the first question that we've got here is from Eric Kurtz from the German Council on Foreign Relations. And he says that given the coup in Myanmar, what lessons can we draw for European support to democratic transition processes, such as in Myanmar, but also Ethiopia or Sudan? So maybe I'll ask you to answer that one, Mr. Zanino, first. So what lessons do you draw for European support to democratic transition processes, such as those in Myanmar, given the coup? Thanks.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the lesson is that democratic transition is a fragile process that needs to be nurtured, and that, I mean, not necessarily is a linear one, and you may have back and forth. I think that collectively, I'm not speaking about the European Union, we have been very supportive on the transition in Myanmar, have tried to be there to provide support to the economy, to the civil society, to the political environment, with all the limits also that this was having. But the result is that again, it's the fragility is still there, and and we have not managed to have the capacity in the country itself, not have the capacity to strengthen its democratic institutions. That said, there are some positive elements which I think are important to underline. The level of participation in the elections is very high, 70%. It's something that essentially is a positive indication of the willingness of the population to be part of this process. We do not know which will be the capacity to, let's say, internal reaction from Myanmar. I think that there's been a very, at least on our side, on the side of the United States, but also on Japan, a very clear condemnation for what has been considered a coup. And this is also an element that we need to work on and to build upon. Now, the question is, how can we manage to, and still insisting on the authorities to go back on and to go back to a more constructive track. That said, again, I mean, there are the element that also we need to take into account is the fact that society themselves needs to develop the capacity to react and to find solutions that are internal within their own societies. We can be supportive. We can, let's say, from outside, provide financial assistance or other kind of assistance in order to help the development, but the solutions have to come from inside.
Richard, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's right. Perhaps I would add that, you know, clearly what's important now is that international actors speak with as united a voice as possible in urging the restoration of civilian rule. Ideally, the Myanmar military will reverse course. The other priority, of course, is that this is likely to fuel popular discontent in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi had lost some of the reputation she had outside the country because of her lack of defense of the Rohingya, but she remains enormously popular in the country. And it's easily possible that this popular discontent will manifest itself in street protests, that people will take to the streets. And then, of course, there's a danger of sort of violent crackdowns by the military. And I think at the same time as urging for the restoration of civilian rule, it's also important that that international actors, that those with influence on the Myanmar military, urge them not to to act with maximum restraint, to not crack down on protesters if they do gather.
Thanks. We've got a very popular question for Mr. Sanino from Anna Penfrat from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office. Thanks, Anna. She would like to know, would it be possible for you to share your priorities as new Secretary General of the EAS, and to continue, how you're going to continue to improve the EU's contributions to conflict prevention and peace building efforts? So it'd be good to get your thoughts on that, Mr. Sanino.
I don't know if it's going to be popular, my reply, but I mean, essentially for me, the main priority that I see is how I can enhance the effectiveness of the response of the European Union when it comes to the area of the external relations. And that implies essentially a very strong work and very intense work that needs to be done with our stakeholders, be them the member states, the Commission, civil society, in order to bring together all these elements to make our action more effective and coherent. So I won't dwell on priorities and themes, but on methods. And that's the because if we can manage to get the methodology right, then we can do a lot of things. Otherwise, if I'm focusing only on one or two priorities, maybe I can get one, but I will lose 10.
Okay, thank you. The next question we've got up, and it's probably going to be our last one, I think, because we're running out of time, is from Paul Nolan at the European Institute of Peace. He says that climate change was number 10 on another of Crisis Group's lists, our 10 conflicts to watch, which we put out with foreign policy. And it states that in that piece, we state that without urgent action, the danger of climate-related conflict will rise in the years ahead. So his question, Paul's question is, how is the EEAS adapting to this worsening situation? So Mr. Sanino, if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, and that goes a little bit in line with what I was saying before, in the sense that for me, the big question is how we can become more effective in areas of foreign policy or of crisis that are not the traditional geographic crisis, but they are going beyond this. If you want, the climate, the green challenge, as the digital challenge or the migration challenge have become, let's say, very key aspects of our agenda. That does not mean that crisis management is less relevant. Crisis management continues to be an important part of the story and continues to be an important part of our activity. But we are relatively more equipped for this kind of action, which is more traditional. Now, the point is how we become operational and effective in these other areas, because more and more we are witnessing a sort of weaponization of these policies. And this can be game changer from many points of view. That's why I think that it is important that we focus now on how we can enhance our effectiveness in all these areas. We need to maybe to rethink the way we work. We need maybe to rethink our the way we are structured. This is a process that I already started doing with my colleagues here in the EIS, but on which then I will need also to go more public in order to redefine the way we work. But we need certainly to overcome the traditional crisis management approach.
Richard, I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on climate change, especially as it relates to what we wrote in the 10 conflicts to watch.
Oh, just very quickly, because I realize we don't have much time. And I think obviously as we wrote in the 10 conflicts to watch, we see climate change. Although the relationship between global warming, between changing weather and conflict is complex, and it varies by country, it varies by how governments are able to deal with it. Clearly, the changes in temperature, the changes in weather patterns are in parts of the world fueling instability and aggravating risks that were already there. I think for us, the important thing is not only that Europe does everything it can to address the challenge, the broader climate crisis, but some of the money that northern governments have promised to the global south, some of the countries that are really on the front line of this, that this materializes, that countries that are particularly vulnerable to instability caused by changing weather patterns, that they have the support they need to help mitigate some of the risks, to help adapt to some of the risks, to help manage some of the tensions that this causes. And maybe let me make one broader point about efforts to tackle the climate crisis and work with other countries on the climate crisis. We published a piece some months ago looking at relations between Russia and Turkey. And I think it was interesting in a few ways. First, because both Russia and Turkey are so active in war making and in peacemaking across parts of the world at a time when Western powers are less involved. But it's also interesting, I think, because Moscow and Ankara back opposing sides in many different conflicts. Their allies fight it out on many different battlefields, but they're able to compartmentalize. They're able to put their disputes, whether it's in Syria or in Libya, or even to some degree in the South Caucasus, to one side and cooperate in other areas. In many ways, they're quite close allies, even as they're fighting on opposite sides of other wars. And it seems that climate change, and like many of the issues that Europe is dealing with, also requires this sort of approach. Not that Europe should draw lessons from Russia and Turkey more broadly, but it lessons in the way that they compartmentalize, that they're able to put differences on some issues to one side, even as they cooperate on others. Mm-hmm. This is, for me, this is in some ways really a symptom of geopolitics today, and particularly in the dilemma that the European Union and Europe finds itself. It's going to have to disagree with China on many things, whether it's trade practices, working with the US to look at Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, some of the things it does at home, but at the same time work with China where that's possible, including particularly on climate change. On peacekeeping in Africa might be another issue. In much the same way, Russia, there's a lot to disagree with Russia about, and there's a lot to coordinate with the US on Europe's approach to Russia. But there are places where Europe needs to work with Russia. Again, climate change is a big one. Working on the South Caucasus might be another one. And even with a close ally like the US, there's going to be areas where where Europe agrees and areas where it disagrees. And I think whether the world can tackle the climate crisis, but also what international efforts to tackle some of the other crises that Crisis Group is dealing with, some of the crises on our watch list, what those efforts look like will really hinge on whether major and regional powers can, again, disagree and compete in some areas while putting those disagreements aside to work together on others.
Can I say that I share this point of view 100%? I think that it's really a very relevant point that you have made, Richard, and this is that's why we need to change our approach. We need to change the way we work. We need to change, how to say, the mentality of how we deal with a number of countries, how we deal with crisis, because we need to readjust to this situation. And it is interesting that the foreign ministers are more and more entering into this kind of let's say, dimension. More and more you see them discussing climate change, you see them discussing migration, you see them discussing digital, just to mention again the big files that we have opened, and how you in all these areas you need to define with whom you work, how to define partnerships, and what it is important. And that's why I go back to the point of the multilateralism as an important framework, because what it is important is that you have a framework within which you can even work on your disagreements, and you have a sort of common rules, or at least, let's say, commonly accepted rules that can help to manage this disagreement. I think that it's, how to say, it's a little bit, it's nice, and I mean, ideally we should all have a world of peace and prosperity and universal love, but at the end of the day, lacking this, we need a world where we have rules where we can manage our disagreement.
Okay, well, I think peace, prosperity, and love are good points to leave the discussion on. I'm sorry that we didn't get to answer all the questions that came through, but I'd really like to thank Mr. Cimino and also Richard for the rich discussion that we've just had. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now, because he's going to be moderating the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and really thank you, Stefano, for joining us. So we're going to go straight into the next session, where we're going to have the opportunity to look in more depth at some of the crises on our watch list this year. So I'm delighted for this second panel to be joined by a number of my crisis group colleagues and 2 colleagues from the EU institutions. In alphabetical order, I'm going to introduce them. I'm joined by Ivan Briscoe, who is Crisis Group's Latin America and Caribbean Program Director. I'm joined by Comfort Iro, who is Crisis Group's long-serving Africa Director. But since Rob Malley left Crisis Group, which Alyssa talked about at the beginning, I'm delighted that Comfort has stepped up into the role of interim vice president. So Comfort Iro, Crisis Group's interim vice president, is also on the panel. Mark Friedrich, who is the deputy director of the foreign policy instruments from the European Commission, is also on the panel. Mark, welcome. Joost Hilterman, Crisis Group's Middle East North Africa director. Olja Olika, our Europe and Central Asia program director, and René van Ness, who's the head of division for the integrated approach for security and peace in the External Action Service. René isn't here yet, but he will also join us. So I think you should have, most of you would have heard Alyssa run through some of the ground rules, but let me just run through them very, very quickly again for people that have just joined. The event's on the record. It's live streamed on YouTube. We've got, I think, more than 300 registered participants, EU policymakers, member state diplomats from Brussels, from capitals, civil society, representatives of think tanks in Europe. Really a great level of participation. So I'm going to try to, over the next hour and a half or so, steer a conversation through some of the crises on our watch list with our program directors and our 2 senior EU officials. We'll try to mention most of the crises on the watch list. If we don't mention one that you would like to hear about, please feel free to raise a question. I think, but Lavinia or someone else who's online can confirm. I think we would like you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll take those as they come and as the conversation allows. So, what I thought we'd do is start, Comfort, with you, to talk about a war that I think is really on a lot of our minds at the moment, and that's the conflict in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. Obviously, it's a hugely important region and a hugely important country. I mean, Ethiopia, really a pivotal country in the Horn of Africa, and already the war has killed thousands of people, displaced many, and reportedly this very, very serious humanitarian situation in parts of the Tigray region. So Comfort, could I ask you to talk a little bit about how things look in Tigray, and in particular to focus on what Europe should do, what the European Union should do to both help end the conflict and ease some of its terrible human cost.
Thank you very much, Richard, and really nice to be on this panel with EU colleagues as well. So, Richard, I mean, you started to provide that grim humanitarian picture. I mean, there's no good news coming out of Tigray at the moment. The humanitarian figures are pretty grim. The war has killed thousands, forced an estimated 50,000 into neighboring Sudan, which is already volatile and going through a very shaky transition of its own. Within Ethiopia itself, 2 million displaced people who are bereft from food and shelter. In addition to that, daily reports from various humanitarian agencies and others who are able to get some kind of access, and those who are reporting from within Ethiopia talk of widespread ethnic targeting, killings, massive looting, rapes, forceful return of refugees, and possible war crimes as well. And also evidence is coming through of looting by Eritrean forces as well. So the humanitarian situation, Richard, before the war was pretty precarious, and now it's really has deteriorated in the last few months as well. Huge parts of Tigray, as you know, is still at war. We've still got, we've got a very strong resistance, a popular resistance by determined groups and the civilian support taking place as well. The government is blaming the Tigrayan for the worsening situation. And yes, while there's been significant sort of damage on by the Tigrayan side, the government is also in denial about its own role. So that's just a very quick picture of the humanitarian situation. In terms of what the EU can do, this is a very good timing for us to be having this conversation, because this month, later this month, the EU will dispatch its humanitarian negotiator to Ethiopia. The foreign minister for Finland, Pekka Haavisto, will be going to Addis Ababa. And the EU has taken two important steps already, which I think is worth highlighting. First was the decision to suspend budget support up to 88.5 million euros. And tied to that, to return to or to get full budget support back on stream, the EU, I think has set out a list of important conditions which we welcome and which we see as crucial to changing the humanitarian situation on the ground. Crucially, the EU has taken a front leadership in asking for widespread unfettered humanitarian access along with the UN to ensure that all aid agencies can reach the affected areas. I think this is an important step. Also an important step is to ensure the security of all refugees in various camps. And as one of the concerns that we heard at the height of the conflict was the insecurity and vulnerability of refugees in those various camps as well. I think it was also important that the EU outlined it in its own conditions was to press home the issue about stopping ethnic targeting and hate speech as well, which is a very worrying development in this crisis as well. One area that I think we were very concerned about was in terms of the humanitarian, the human rights violations. The Ethiopia has its own human rights commission that is headed by a very prominent, well-respected human rights activist. And that body can play a very central role in terms of monitoring the human rights violations in the country, and it would have legitimacy in being a homegrown initiative. So I think tied to that EU condition is just to emphasize the role that a homegrown body can already play in terms of ensuring independent verification of crimes that have been committed in the Tigray as well. I'd also say, tied to that, Richard, a point that we have emphasized is the re-establishment of communications, media access, but also that the government has to find a way in which to tolerate dissent and also to tolerate the possibility of journalists to be able to go to Tigray to also ensure that there's full understanding of the conflict, but also to help pull away from this counterproductive blame and counter blame that you're seeing from both the Tigrayan and the government side as well. These are crucial conditions that the EU has put on the table, and we would urge the EU, especially as its envoy now goes into Addis Ababa, to maintain this principled stance that it's already put together. It's a very good one. We've emphasized that it should be backed by all other international actors, the UN, and particularly Ethiopia's international allies. Of course, as you know, Richard, this is a very delicate dance for the European Union, which sees Ethiopia as a crucial political partner, sees Ethiopia as an important anchor state in the region. But it's very important that if we're going to roll back on the grim humanitarian situation, that there has to be some hard talk on the political gains that are necessary for Ethiopia if we're going to change the humanitarian dynamics that are worsening by the day. On top of that, Richard, and I'll stop here and we can come back for other issues. On top of the Tigrayan crisis, you have other crises bubbling away in the country that also complicate the humanitarian picture. So if we don't begin to arrest the tide of these crises, we're going to see a further slide and deterioration in the country. So this is a good time on the eve of the envoy going into Ethiopia for us to have this candid conversation about how to support these conditions that the EU has already laid down on the table.
Thank you very much, Comfort. So really a very worrying picture, but I think very clear guidance and support for the position so far that the European Union, that Brussels has taken. Mark, could I ask you to come in and Comfort's outline some of the things that we appreciate that the EU is doing, some of the things that we would like it to build on its current approach and do. Would you like to come in on anything that Comfort said?
Sure, thanks very much, Richard. And let me first of all start by congratulating both you and Comfort and also International Crisis Group overall over the recent appointment of Rob and the prominence that you have gained through that, but also more so still through the work that you have been doing for us and for the world. Very briefly on what Comfort has already outlined in a very clear way. Obviously, I won't speak too much about the humanitarian assistance, where DG ECHO is clearly in the lead. The mission, the upcoming mission of the Finnish Prime Minister has been mentioned. The Commissioner Lenarchik has recently been. Indeed, as Comfort was outlining, there is the issue at the moment is not so much the mobilization of the actors or of the funds, it is the access and the need for the Ethiopian authorities to provide that access. And that is where I think the leverage of the current EU discussions are certainly is certainly focusing. To try and see that jointly with our multilateral partners, we maintain a firm position and do not provide legitimacy to a covering up of the violence that has occurred. Now, Comfort also mentioned the importance of following up on some of the allegations about human rights violations. The deteriorating human rights situation in the country, not only in Tigray, but also in other parts, is certainly a key risk factor for future instability. And that is something that we in the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, jointly with the colleagues at the EES, are extremely concerned about and are looking into, and where the EU is already providing support to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and we are currently looking at beefing that up to make sure that the investigative capacities match indeed the needs that are currently there, and will also there indeed look to work closely with the UN on that. I think there was a question previously in the panel about how how we consider democracy support in view of recent events. The example that was mentioned was Myanmar, but also Ethiopia. I think it's simply very clear that when in Ethiopia the transition started, the risks that it entailed, I think were quite obvious. Maybe we didn't see at the time that it would pan out in this way. But I think it's been obvious over the last few years that there is an imminent risk at very many different in very many different parts of the country, in different parts of society, and this is something that we have been trying to address by working both with shaping up the capacities of political parties to undertake democratic pluralistic discussions, but also working with electoral authorities and organizations working in this field to try and make the elections more secure in future. So that's, I think, what I would want to add to what Comfort has already outlined. I'll leave it here. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I should add that obviously what's happened in Tigray was, to some degree, it's terrible. It's been a real blow to the transition under Prime Minister Abiy. But the Crisis Group has been very supportive of that transition since Prime Minister Abiy assumed power. But we've also warned early. Comfort and her team have been really at the forefront of warning of some of the dangers in the transition, some of the forces, the ethno-nationalist forces that it unlocked. Rene, could I turn to you to reflect a little bit on the role of the External Action Service in Ethiopia?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard, and it's great to be with you today. As this is the first time that I am able to take the floor, let me thank ICG for organizing this panel, for organizing many other opportunities to discuss with you, to exchange with your researchers. You're really a value to us and to the work that we do. So really most appreciated, and I look forward to continuing that collaboration with you. Ethiopia is really close to my heart. I lived there for 4 years, and it's a country that once you live there will never leave you, as it is indeed such a special place. So terrible to see this situation now. I think Ethiopia made great strides, actually made an enormous development over the last decade with economic growth figures that would make any government in the world jealous. And to see this now is just absolutely heartbreaking. So as Comfort explained, situation in Ethiopia extremely worrisome, very difficult, also difficult to help, difficult to find access points, difficult to find entry points to start to engage. You basically need two hands to clap, and it's not always easy in Ethiopia to find these entry points to have that engagement, to really start to do something useful in terms of dialogue, support, or indeed, if you take that further, mediation. You've seen all the formal expressions of our concern, call for immediate cessation of hostilities and for the resolution of political disputes. All of that we have done, and it is important that we have done that so quickly and so outspoken, and of course in full coordination with the African Union and the UN. Comfort mentioned it already. I just want to mention it very briefly because it is quite special, and it's not entirely the EAS responsibility, and I hope my colleagues from the Commission will allow me to mention this again. Stopping something like budget support is a big thing for the EU. But as explained by both Commissioner Urpilainen and High Representative Borrell, yes, Ethiopia will always remain a very important partner in the Horn, but we cannot accept the current situation, and therefore we did stop the delivering of this budget support. So for those of you who do not know what budget support is, that is basically a transfer directly into the treasury of a country. And I think that is the conversation that you need to have with your partners and say, okay, here you have crossed the number of principles. These are my conditions. Humanitarian access, protection of civilians, investigation of human rights and atrocities, and indeed, as mentioned, access to media, especially in Tigray. So this is really part of the political engagement that we have with the Ethiopians. Clear that Mark, as Mark said, it's and I think you said it as well, Richard. It doesn't come as a full surprise if you have such a strong ethnic federalist policy and you basically abandon that. You need to replace it with something else that's an alternative that people can buy into, and we have followed that development very closely with a considerable concern that it could easily lead to an expression of, say, nationalism at the level of the regions that we see now. Of course, we are worried now. We're worried about the implications for the region. We're worried about the Sudanese-Ethiopian border. And of course, you also immediately see a translation of these difficulties in the talks about the GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. As you know, that's a real concern as it affects the Nile and therefore Sudan and Egypt. So politically, we are really engaged. Alex Rondos, the EUSR, is heavily involved. We're happy that we can provide him with some assistance in this. So there is a lot of political engagement, of course, together with the key players there, the African Union and the UN. We're really looking forward to the visit of Pekka Avisto that has been asked by the High Representative to be the EU envoy there. And obviously, we're looking forward to a stronger and more united transatlantic front with the new US administration, as it is really important to team up. I think Ethiopia is one of those countries where you can only say, if you want to do something as ambitious as to bring peace to a country like that, you will never be able to do that alone. You have to do that with other partners. And therefore, we are really looking forward to teaming up with partners in government and indeed with civil society. Many thanks, and back to you.
Thank you, Rene. So I'd like to turn now to the South Caucasus and to Nagorno-Karabakh. And if the war in Tigray was one new war that started last year, another was the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh. There were these incidents on the border which led to an offensive by Azerbaijan that ended up with Baku recapturing much of the territory that it had lost 3 decades before. Olya, you and your team have been following the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict very closely. You monitor what's happening, what happened with the fighting, what's happening now. Could you very briefly talk a little bit about where things stand now? And again, explore a little bit how the European Union can help what is not a stable peace, but a ceasefire, how the European Union can help convert that into something that's more stable.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so, and thanks everybody for taking part in this discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to all of the conversation so far. So you say the war is over in the sense that the fighting is over, and in terms of who is in control of what on the ground, it's been a bit of a flip of the situation back in 1994 when the first war ended, in that Azerbaijan has regained control of most of the territory that Armenia had gotten control over back by the end of 1994. The exception is the majority of the breakaway region of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. And in the portion of that region that Azerbaijan has not gotten hold of, there are Russian peacekeepers deployed, but the self-proclaimed independent Karabakh government is still what is effectively in administrative control there. Refugees who fled Karabakh, ethnic Armenian refugees who fled Karabakh have been returning in fairly large numbers, not all of them, but many of them, those who fled during this most recent fighting. Azerbaijani and their descendants, their families who had to leave that region and the 7 parts of Azerbaijan that Armenian forces had captured back in 1994, are very slowly starting to trickle in. The infrastructure is in there. It's it's largely in ruins, but the Azerbaijani government is thinking a lot about how to bring them back. But as you say, what Russia brokered on November 10th to end the war is a ceasefire, not a peace. And to a large extent, there's a lot left undecided intentionally. The tough issues, whether it's status for Karabakh itself or the details of the mandate for Russian peacekeepers, are being left to be decided later, maybe in part to be decided by the circumstances as they unfold. For now, what Baku and Yerevan have agreed to, again under Russian auspices, is to develop working groups to start planning for the economic and transport infrastructure that's going to reconnect the region, right? Because Armenia has been effectively isolated by and from both Azerbaijan and Turkey for these nearly 3 decades. Now, we don't know how this will work. We don't know how this is all going to shake out. The Armenian domestic political situation is very tenuous in the wake of a military defeat. But the question of rebuilding the infrastructure, rebuilding the links in the region does seem to be the obvious place, if not the only place, for the EU to get involved. The challenge here, or one of the many challenges, is that this is about getting involved in an environment where Moscow is running the show, where Ankara is playing a substantial role. The Russian-Turkish Peacekeeping Monitoring Center is now apparently up and running in Azerbaijan. But the EU and its member states and the United States were pretty much on the margins of getting to ceasefire. Now, this should have really shocked nobody. Russia has for a very long time been the most active and the most engaged outside power in this conflict. And certainly it was the only one that was ready and willing to send peacekeepers and to act quickly. I mean, I suppose Turkey would have happily sent peacekeepers, but that was going to be a non-starter for Armenia. So in this atmosphere of tremendous tension with Russia over so many things, you have to ask, can the EU get engaged without it seeming like a gift to Russia? You know, and this kind of harkens back to some of the other conversations that were part of the last panel. And in line with that, I would say that that's exactly what selective engagement is supposed to look like, right? And I would also say that EU engagement is actually critical to making a real peace possible. And that means the infrastructure aid and transport and reconnection is really very much in line with the sort of assistance and engagement the EU has had in the region and with partner countries in the past. It's also continued humanitarian support and healthcare support, which it has already undertaken, often through international organizations. And I think it's also about reinvigorating programs to build ties between societies, which the EU has tried to do over the last 30 years, but a process that has become rather stagnant in the face of increasing isolation of these societies from one another. And I would also say that one of the most important things that EU engagement, whether it's through the EU Special Representative for the region, through the member states, through the OSCE Chair in Office for 2021, which is Sweden, through all of these put together, EU engagement helps ensure that Karabakh and its resolution remains a global and not just a regional problem. And I do think that in and of itself is going to be critical to a lasting peace that really does build prosperity in the region.
Very good, Olia. Thank you so much. Mark, let me turn to you very quickly, and we need to keep things moving quite fast. As I realize that with just these first two conflicts, we've already consumed a lot of our time. But Mark, the FPI, the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, you're really on the sort of the first line of the European Union's response in Nagorno-Karabakh. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing, what you're thinking of doing to sort of rebuild peace along the lines that Olia talked about?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Richard. I mean, what we've been engaged with for over 10 years already now is to support sort of cross-line contacts between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, obviously, when the fighting broke out, that was made a lot more difficult. But I mean, one reflection on what went before, because I mean, we've been doing this for 10 years. Normally, we're not meant to be working in one context for such a long time. And every time we were sort of renewing that program, we were thinking, does this still make sense? Does it still work? Does it still add value? To be supporting something that, you know, at the time people very much described as a frozen conflict, probably wrongly so. We now know wrongly so. But I think that sort of building on some of those contacts now is certainly something that we are looking to do. We need to be very careful in doing that. We're working very closely with the EUSR and the delegations on that. Simply because what this recent violent conflict has shown is also that not all of the partners that we have worked with there are equally well placed to pass a message of non-violence in these new circumstances now. But for the most part, we have certainly seen that the partners who've had the possibility to have cross-line exchanges over the last 10 years have tried to maintain those where it was no longer possible to do so by travel, obviously isn't at the moment. They are nevertheless trying to remain in touch and are looking into ways into how they, from their perspectives as journalists, as civil society representatives, as business people, can contribute to a rapprochement between Azerbaijan and Armenia on this sensitive issue. Now, the new element that we will also be looking at, and I'll stop after that, is to look at one of the features of this most recent conflict has been the use of social media. Certainly, this isn't the first conflict, but this is happening. But the hate messages about the other side that have been countering sort of our reconciliation and peace building efforts have been promulgated from groups that are close to the two governments, and in some cases even within the government it is suspected. And we will be looking at how we can potentially counter that in our work. I'll stop here, Richard.
Thank you, Mark. Let's move now to another conflict hugely important for Europe, for the European Union, and turn to Joost so you can talk a little bit, Joost, about Libya. There's been this ceasefire last October, which has reduced the levels of violence, but if I understand it, there's still a long way to go. The formation of an interim government discussions are still underway. Some of the terms of the ceasefire are unclear, particularly those related to foreign fighters. Could you talk a little bit about where things stand at the moment in Libya, and again on what the European Union, what member states can do to help build on that ceasefire?
Thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone for this discussion on Libya. First of all, I should say that it's really heartening to see, after several years of things in the Middle East just deteriorating, that finally we have the chance maybe of some kind of reduction in the tensions because of the Biden administration coming into the Oval Office. But even in Libya, where I think that is less related. But in Yemen, they're still fighting. At the same time, we see possibilities of a way forward. The conflict in Syria is mostly frozen. Now, we'll talk about Iran in a minute. Also, the situation may de-escalate. In Libya, importantly, there is a ceasefire after a major offensive that lasted for more than a year on the capital. But we're not out of the woods yet. First of all, the ceasefire, as Richard, as you said, has not been implemented yet, and I'll give you a little bit of detail in a second. There is a political process, but it is stuttering, and it's not clear how it should move forward, how it could move forward, and the EU certainly has a role there. And we have also the money problem, where oil revenues are currently in a frozen account and not accessible. And that needs to become unfrozen, and it cannot wait for a new government to be formed, because it doesn't look like a new government will be formed anytime soon. So first of all, the ceasefire. So this is a very welcome development, agreed to by the two sides, meaning the government in Tripoli and the Haftar-controlled side in the east in October, which called for a withdrawal from the front lines by the respective military forces, a halt to external training of these military forces, a withdrawal of private military contractors, etc., etc. These are the main issues. Now, what we've seen since then is none of this has happened, but the ceasefire is still there. In other words, there has not been a return to fighting. Military cargo planes continue to touch down on both sides, coming in from outside, be it from the Haftar side, which is supported by the UAE and Russia and Egypt, or on the Tripoli government side, which is supported by Turkey and Qatar, most of all. So that's one thing. The private military contractors of the Wagner company, the Russian company, are still on the Haftar side. They are present on the ground. Not fighting at the moment, but they're there, and they should have been withdrawn. And there are other private military contractors on that side as well that are still remaining on the ground. And the forces of the two sides haven't really withdrawn from the front lines. They're still there. So this has to happen. Now, the United Nations has proposed a ceasefire monitoring mechanism with the agreement of the two sides in the Libyan conflict. And so there is an initial agreement to deploy civilian unarmed monitors. And these would supposedly come from some European countries that the Libyan sides can agree to. This has yet to happen. So what can the EU do now to move this forward? Well, it should support the monitoring mechanism and make available monitors when that moment comes. So that is critical. It should support a new, more detailed ceasefire agreement that goes into some of the problems with the existing one, and flesh it out, and then have ask the United Nations Security Council to support it in a resolution. I think that's very important. And the Operation Irini of the European Union, it can do also its bit in monitoring troop movements and alerting the world to any troop movements that might violate the ceasefire. That's on the military side, linked directly to the ceasefire. Then there is the political side. Now, there are political talks that are going on. The two parallel rival parliaments in the East and the West are meeting to discuss the establishment of an interim government that would then organize elections by the end of the year, maybe parliamentary and presidential and local. It's not entirely clear. That this needs to be sorted out. Now, this is supposed to happen, this interim government, by the end of, or some kind of agreement anyway on the procedures for establishing one by the end of this month. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And the alternative, the fallback, if you will, is that there is a second mechanism that consists of 75 delegates selected by the United Nations, or selected, under the supervision of the United Nations, who also have been meeting, and who could, as a fallback, also establish an interim government. So if the two parliaments fail to do so, then these 75 delegates could move toward it. But there are many, many divisions between them, as you can imagine. And so even there, the path is not clear. The second fallback, if all of that fails, is to just go ahead and organize at least parliamentary elections by December of this year. For that, there has to be a new electoral law. So again, it's not going to be easy, straightforward. And electronic voting cards will have to be issued and things like that. But what is the alternative? The alternative, in the end, is a return to fighting, and that, of course, we need to prevent. So the EU can do much to support the political process and nudge the parties through the external sponsors of the various parties to the conflict, and directly by working with the Libyan actors to steer them in the right direction. Finally, on the income side of things, the revenues have been oil revenues have been put in a special account in September. Again, an agreement between the Tripoli government and the Haftar side. That money was meant to come unfrozen when an interim government was in place. That has not happened because there is no interim government. There has to be another mechanism. And the EU could also use its good offices with the two sides to find a mechanism to unfreeze that. And I think part of that would have to include some kind of reassurance to the Haftar side that the money that accrues to the central budget, and therefore to the Tripoli government, would not be used to finance the Tripoli side's military forces at the exclusion of the Haftar's military forces, and that the money would then be spent to the benefit of all Libyans and not just in the West, for example, as opposed to the whole country.
Joost, thank you very much. René, let me turn to you for a quick response. As Joost has outlined, European countries aren't as involved in Libya as some of the direct backers of the two sides, whether it's Turkey or the Emirates or Russia. But there is still an enormous amount that Europe can do, as Joost said, whether it's supporting the ceasefire, monitoring the ceasefire, pushing the parties towards compromise, nudging their external backers to in turn push them towards compromise. Could you reflect a little bit on some of what Joost said and what the External Action Service is doing?
Yeah, thanks. That would be my pleasure to do so. of course, you will not see the EU active in Libya in the same way as you see, as you call them, the external backers. But let me give you a hint, an indication of what it is that is indeed happening. Libya is, of course, tremendously important to the EU. It is literally on our doorstep, and the future of Libya is therefore of a real relevance to the EU. So that's why we are really supporting the offices of the UN SRSG, and we're tremendously happy with the appointment of Jan Kubic as the new SRSG, and really looking forward to working with him. So the UN is indeed in the lead of that overall peace process, you know, what we are doing is supporting the UN with a strategy that is focusing on fostering dialogue through a number of projects, many of the projects funded through Mark's outfit, the FPI, the ICSP funded projects. And some of them have been tremendously successful and indeed have been the basis for the current ceasefire. So I think the EU is sometimes a little bit too modest. The role that we play is indeed sometimes critically important. What we try to do in Libya is have the whole range of interventions. So you will see a strong support to fostering this dialogue, you know, for example, through the national dialogue process that has been happening over the last few years, but also contributing to the enforcement of the UN arms embargo. That is not always difficult to see what the impact is, but I think that through this Operation Irini, it has indeed become a lot more difficult to bring in weapons into Libya. Has that meant that there are no weapons? No, of course not, but it is indeed a lot more difficult than it was in the past. So these interventions are surely important. To give you another suggestion, and Joost was referring to it already, the economic dimension is of course critically important. Well, here the EU is co-chairing the economic working group as it has been created under what they call the Berlin process, and that group is actually making most of the progress of all the working groups that exist. So all the issues that Joost mentioned are being discussed, and actually, almost to the surprise of colleagues working on those issues, they really make progress on the unification of the budget, on the distribution of oil revenues, on the functioning of the central bank. All of that, there are very positive developments there, and most of them are now basically requiring a political agreement. And of course, that's where the pain is. So we need as well progress on the political track. So here, very important to reach out diplomatically to indeed all these external backers to make sure that the Libyans are able to take decisions that are in the interest of their own people without the interference of these other actors. So you can imagine that requires very intensive diplomatic engagements with the familiar big parties that are of influence to the Libyan process. So these are exciting times now. As you know, from the 1st of February until the end of this week, they are in Geneva, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, indeed to vote on a new presidency council. Let's see what comes out of that. I had the pleasure to work a few years on Libya, and I know that time is often has a bit of a different dimension there, so that may take a bit longer, but we are positive that something constructive will come out. A last few words. Yes, we are talking to the UN about how we can contribute to the ceasefire. That is not easy, as you can imagine, because here the Libyans are very clear in what it is that they are not willing to accept. And so whatever we will do there, I can assure you we will do that while fully respecting the principles of Libyan ownership. And I hope that at the next forum like this, I'm able to tell you in a bit more detail what it is that we can concretely do to contribute to monitoring the still holding ceasefire, which is in itself, of course, already quite a success. Let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you, René. We'll look forward to some of those discussions with you. Let's we're not running out of time, but we have got a lot of questions that are building up in the Q&A box, which is great. So let's move now to Latin America. Ivan, we talked very briefly. I talked very briefly about Venezuela in the first panel. Could I ask you to talk in a bit more depth and with more eloquence than I managed to about where the crisis in Venezuela stands, and in particular, what a new administration in the US means after 4 years or some years of maximum pressure, a strategy that I think has largely backfired. What should the approach now of Europe be? How should it work with the US to think through a new Venezuela policy?
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you to everybody in this event. I mean, Richard, you summarized the problems with the maximum pressure strategy and where it's left Venezuela very nicely, so I won't go over that again. But I think it's important to consider what the new US government means, not just for Venezuela, but for the whole of Latin America. It's obviously extremely important. It's, if you like, the regional hegemon. But Trump's policy was dual, as it were, to Latin America. You had maximum pressure and extreme confrontation with a number of states, Venezuela, Cuba in particular, obviously the issue of migration with Mexico, although that ended up in an extremely good relationship between Trump and the Mexican president. And for the rest of Latin America, largely indifference, a degree of permissiveness, a degree of detachment, unless there were core US security strategic interests involved. So this has obviously changed. The Biden administration has made it very clear, senior officials made it very clear that there will be much more engagement in Latin America. We're returning to the language of partnership, of multilateralism, of a joint focus on some core issues such as climate change, security challenges, the rule of law, corruption, and a turn away from maximum pressure. For all the reasons you mentioned, Richard, it hasn't proved effective. It consolidated the regime rather than fracturing it. And the offensive launched by Juan Guaido with US support didn't end up working. So the US and the EU now are broadly on the same page. Today, there has been a video conference of the International Contact Group to discuss the state of play regarding Venezuela, what could be done with negotiations. The US clearly is looking towards a path of negotiations towards a settlement, but both the US and the EU are also extremely critical of the Maduro government for obvious reasons. It's a repressive, authoritarian government now. It has systematically denied or curbed humanitarian aid, and it is largely responsible for the huge exodus from the country. So it's very difficult to be immediately open towards the Maduro government. So what can be done in this situation? Well, I think the bottom line is that within Venezuela, the circumstances remain extremely hard. It's difficult to see how the two sides could immediately in the short term get together around a table and start talking. There is a crackdown ongoing. There are still hundreds of political prisoners. There are extrajudicial executions taking place. There are arrests of humanitarian actors and human rights activists occurring very frequently. These are not conditions in which talking between the sides is at all easy. And of course, Latin America remains highly polarized. Venezuela has still got its two main neighbors. Colombia and Brazil are still highly antagonistic towards the Maduro government, which doesn't make Maduro and his ministers feel particularly comfortable about sitting down for talks either. So what could be done by the US and the EU, since they share similar values, similar approaches to get things going in Venezuela? Well, I think the first step has to be, taking the model of the International Contact Group and broadening engagement by the US and the EU in Latin America, and also with the supporters of Maduro. I think it's very important that all Latin American countries are brought on board the idea of a structured, peaceful settlement in Venezuela. And that includes those democratic governments, democratic left governments, such as Argentina and Mexico and Bolivia, that are a little bit skeptical towards the US position over the last few years. And it also involves talking to Maduro's allies. Cuba is particularly important in this regard, and a lot will depend on the US seeking to renormalize its relationships with Cuba and encouraging Cuba to support this multilateral effort. It's not going to be easy at all. And obviously Russia and China are also very important factors, given that they've enabled Maduro to survive economically over the last few years. Realism on all sides is absolutely essential. In the opposition side, I don't think there will be any possibility of talks if the primary condition is that Maduro step down immediately. So I think there's going to have to be some rethinking around that. Humanitarian aid is essential, but that will also require a degree of confidence building between the sides, and could be used as a stepping stone towards political talks. And lastly, and I think this is a really crucial one, because it's the incentive structure, the main incentive structure, which the US has to play with. The EU doesn't have it so much because its sanctions are individually focused, but the sanctions imposed by the US over the last few years, since 2017, have affected the entire Venezuelan economy, have made it very difficult for Venezuela to get over this extreme economic collapse, which is the responsibility of the government, but made worse by sanctions. So connecting sanctions lifting with moves by the Venezuelan government to lift its crackdown, to release prisoners, to re-establish political and civil rights, probably under a UN monitoring umbrella, would be the way forward, the ideal way forward. But that will require diplomatic channels and a degree of confidence. So we hope that this will get the process moving, but it's going to be difficult in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on in a moment to Iran. I would just say to the panelists, if you look at the Q&A, there's questions that are coming up there. There's quite a few questions there already. I will, after a couple more interventions from you all, I will come to some of these questions, and so think through those that think through your answers to those that make most sense for you. Joost, let's talk a little bit about Iran. We talked in the earlier group about how maximum pressure there, if it had fallen short in Venezuela, it was really a failure in Iran. Now there's a new US administration, as you mentioned, new opportunity for Europe to help the US get back to the JCPOA, to have a new approach towards Iran, to calm this increasingly perilous standoff that Washington and Tehran have had across the region. What do you think should be the next steps for the Biden administration? How can Europe, how can the European Union support that?
Thanks, Richard. So we have clearly articulated our positions on what should happen next. These positions we articulated at the time that Rob Malley was still our president and CEO. So he was very much put his stamp on it. Now he has gone to the Biden administration to become the Iran envoy. And we can only hope that he will implement the recommendations that he made to the Biden administration before he joined it. So we very much want a quick return to the JCPOA as it stood in 2015. We don't want to tinker with the deal at this stage because we think that could become an endless process that probably will fail in the end. So the better way is a clean US re-entry into the deal and a simultaneous and the exact mechanism to synchronize these steps by the two sides would have to be worked out, but a simultaneous reversal by Iran of the various steps that it has taken over the last 2 or 3 years to violate its commitments under the JCPOA. And of course, and this is for Iran the most important part, for the United States to lift the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on Iran after after it withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018. So that would be step number one, but the choreography is going to be tricky. And there are a number of considerations. One, of course, from the Iranian side is, why would you trust the United States again? If it comes to an agreement and then the next administration cancels it. And I think you, Richard, already mentioned earlier that, we don't know who will be in the White House 4 years from now. And it may well be an administration that is adversarial to the whole notion of multilateral deals and non-proliferation agreements. So there's that. And the other thing is that the JCPOA was accomplished by carving it out from other issues that divided, especially the United States and Iran. Of course, it's broader than the United States, but it's especially the United States. And that includes the Iranian ballistic missile program. It includes its regional power projection, and it includes its human rights situation at home. These are issues that were left out. That is why the nuclear deal could come to be. And but those issues cannot be left unaddressed. And I think the Obama administration realized that, but it didn't have the time to move forward on these matters until it was replaced by the Trump administration, which of course then pursued the maximum pressure campaign. But the states and US allies in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, Israel, United Arab Emirates, and some others, are very keen for these issues to be put back on the table and for them to have a voice in any negotiation over a restoration of the JCPOA and a follow-on deal. And that is going to be the very difficult task that the Biden team under Rob Malley is going to face. But the EU can play a very helpful role. In the initial stages, I think there have to be, also from the United States, but there has to be some messaging that makes clear that the intent is to return to the deal. And I think even appointing Rob Malley is a clear message by the United States to Iran that the United States means business. It wants to go back to the deal, and it wants to make a good faith effort to do so, regardless of the difficulty. And the European Union can help with that by maybe reviving the plan that President Macron launched a couple of years ago about the pre-purchase of Iranian oil, for example, in exchange, of course, for no further Iranian violations of the deal. Those have to be halted. Europe can also provide additional humanitarian aid or facilitate other international humanitarian aid to Iran because of COVID, of course. And it can help usher in a IMF loan, again, for the COVID situation that has been blocked so far by the United States. And it can promote trade, because Instex, the mechanism that was there to promote trade between Europe and Iran, it hasn't really functioned. It functioned symbolically more than anything. But that symbolism vanished rather quickly in Iranian eyes because the reality wasn't there in any substantive way. And Europe can help maybe by providing encouragement to companies that are fearful of sanctions still, if they engage in business with Iran. The European Union can provide tax breaks to companies to encourage them and consider other mechanisms to speed up trade with Iran. And I think, finally, it is very important for Europe to also play a role that the Biden administration should not be playing directly, but can support indirectly, which is to encourage an intra-Gulf, meaning between the GCC, Iran, and Iraq dialogue that is inclusive of these 8 states on the security in the Gulf. And it is both hard security and soft security. That is a critical role or a critical thing that needs to happen. And European governments, with the help of with Mr. Borrell, with the help of the UN Secretary General, can encourage the Gulf states to take that kind of courageous initiative. And those discussions, I know, are taking place already and can now step up because we know that the Biden administration, it still needs to come out explicitly say so, but does support such an initiative.
Very good. Yes, thank you very much. So we've talked a little bit about the implications of a new team in the US and the Biden administration for the conflicts in Iran and in Venezuela. I want to stay on that theme, but come off the watch list just for a moment. And Olli, I'll ask you a little bit about Europe-Russia relations, given their importance. Could you reflect a little bit on Brussels' relationship with Moscow, European capitals' relationship with Moscow, and what a new team in Washington might mean for that?
Sure, thanks. So having a team in Washington that is clearly committed to Euro-Atlantic cooperation makes for space to align and smarten up policy towards Russia that frankly hasn't been there over the last 4 years. That doesn't mean that that's easy, right? It's a huge, complicated agenda. Relations between Western countries and Russia are tense, to say the least. They're certainly not improving. The war in Ukraine is a critical linchpin, but it's hard to look at that and see a lot of promise of positive movement there until and unless Russia, and honestly also Ukraine, shift policies. As of now, much of EU and US policy vis-a-vis Russia is tied to Ukraine and specifically to Russian implementation of the Minsk agreements. But while Russia certainly bears much responsibility, it can't implement Minsk by itself. And Ukraine's bottom line position on the agreements is that the deal needs to be adapted or at least interpreted something other than literally. And in the meantime, you do have all of these other problems: dangerous military incidents in and near the Baltic Sea area, military buildups in and near the Black Sea, months on end of violent crackdowns on protests in Belarus, and of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, which we already talked to that. Add to that, Mr. Navalny, whose sentencing we've been promised to hear the results of in about 20 minutes. And you get a package in which there's a lot that Brussels and Washington might want to do vis-a-vis Russia, but their leverage tools don't quite match their desires. So this is going to take smart diplomacy, realistic engagement, and perhaps some redefinition of red lines to make sure they're credible to move forward. For Ukraine, we've written about this before, and the argument we've made is that the current framework of the sanctions regime, and here I'm echoing my colleagues in a lot of ways, with its all or nothing conditions tied to the Minsk agreement, haven't changed Moscow's policy. They've sent signals of dissatisfaction, absolutely. They've possibly punished Russia and maybe some Russians, but they haven't, don't seem to have changed Moscow's policy, at least not recently. So if we want real progress, we need Russia to accept Ukraine's sovereignty and to get its forces and its support out of Ukraine. And we need Ukraine to start truly planning to integrate the territory in its east, the whole point of this war. And I mention that because we do have a strong movement in Ukraine to basically walk away from that and accept a frozen conflict. So with neither facing an incentive, can the EU and the US together change that? And we would argue that by smartening up sanctions to make them a little more flexible, both to give Russia incentive to compromise and to give Brussels and Washington room to escalate if they don't. And also to make clear that Ukraine, that support and assistance are tied to reintegrating Donbass, and thus this means disengaging forces, promoting cross-line trade and contacts and so forth, you could get some movement. Now, progress on European security writ large goes hand in hand with progress on Ukraine. They're interdependent, but you do also need that movement. The US has taken an important step forward by working with Moscow to extend New START. Conversations with Russia about security are probably more NATO's job than that of the EU, but the countries affected are pretty much the same. So working with the Americans and the Russians, perhaps to save the Open Skies Treaty, that might be a good first priority, but Baltic and Black Sea security are going to be on the agenda. But it's a big agenda and it's a difficult agenda. And by laying these things out, I don't want to in any way minimize the difficulty. I do think having leadership in Washington willing to work with, collaborate with, listen to European allies increases the odds of success.
Thank you, Olia. Rene, can I bring you in briefly? So we reflected in the first panel with Mr. Sanino a little bit about what the new US administration might mean for Europe's crisis management, its efforts to resolve some of the conflicts on our watch list this time. Do you want to reflect a little bit on that as well?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I wasn't there, so I run a risk to say something else as my new Secretary General. So you put me in the hot seat here. Well, you know, I think it's one thing is clear. There's a few things where the EU has always been very clear, and that is we need a multilateral system. So for us, a rules-based global order is absolutely essential. We are dead convinced that without that, we will not be able to achieve peace, security, and prevent conflicts. And that's great if we feel that in Europe. But if you are alone and you have no partners, then the whole thing becomes a little bit more difficult. And I think that is sort of what happened over the last few years. So we really regretted the withdrawal of the previous US administration from a number of multilateral engagements. And to be honest, they were not really there to pass that same message. For the EU, that was an important realization. Initially, maybe even a little shock. And so as a tiny silver lining of these last 4 years, I think what we've seen in Europe is a reflection where we said, you know, we need to be able to stand our own ground in a stronger way as the EU. So you've probably seen the High Representative during the Foreign Affairs Council in December, where he talked about developing proposals on how to strengthen the EU's diplomatic toolbox and instruments to help strengthen our resilience and influence in the world. And he used this often misunderstood phrase of strategic autonomy. I mean, for me, strategic autonomy doesn't mean that the EU wants to do it alone, not at all. We will always remain committed to this multilateralism, but it means that we should indeed be more able to stand our own ground. And when we are going to look at the new transatlantic relations, and we are really looking forward to developing them, then I think they will in that sense be different, because I think we are better placed now with a stronger position towards building those relations and able to articulate our sort of own geopolitical orientations. I mean, there's basically no end to where you can engage. If you have an ally like the US, we talked about Iran, we talked about, Olga talked about Russia, Ukraine, our neighborhood, Horn of Africa, critically important, Latin America, we heard Ivan talk about that, Asia, the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I really hope that Blinken will soon have his team together, because there will be no end to the number of dossiers that we should jointly discuss. In international fora, of course, being able to speak the same language, agree on these broad, big principles will help to push peace building and conflict prevention policies. So you need to have partners to do that, to push democracy and human rights and the rule of law and peace and all these values that we thought were almost a given, and where all of a sudden really realized over the last 4 years that even those are not sacred anymore. So we are really enthusiastic about the signals coming from Washington and look forward to re-engaging with them again. Thank you.
Rene, thank you very much. So we have about half an hour left on the panel. So what I thought I'd do was give you all 4 minutes, as there's 6 of you, and give Comfort a little bit longer because she has a few other questions to deal with. And I'll ask you we'll go around again, and I'll ask each of you to have a sort of last word. Any reflections on anything that we've talked about, anything else that you would like to highlight in your regions. And as I come to each of you, I'll ask you whichever questions are relevant to you that have come up from the Q&A. If there are other questions as I go through in the Q&A, please don't hesitate to type them in. We'll do our best to cover them. But we'll try to do the last half an hour like that. So we'll go in a slightly different order. Ivan, let's start with you, if that's okay. We've got questions for you, one on Venezuela. Which actor or combination of actors has the leverage to convince President Maduro to stand down? That's the first one. We've got a question on the terrible impacts of the COVID pandemic across Latin America, which you can see. What is happening, and what can Europe do to help? You've got another one about how the EU and others can support civil society in a country like Venezuela, given some of the restrictions in civil political rights. So you've got that question. And you could also, in your 4 minutes, if you would like to reflect a little bit on our entry on Mexico and Central America, and looking at how the relationship between the pandemic and levels of violence, how that's played out there. If you can manage that as well, you definitely get a medal.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, I'll do my best. How to make Maduro stand down? Well, very difficult, because the more you press, the more you push, the less likely he is to do so. The reason for that, well, there are various reasons, but one of the fundamental ones is the nature of Chavismo. It has a rhetoric, political rhetoric about the defense of the nation, the sovereign defense of the nation, which might seem superficially insignificant. It might seem that that's just a pretense for what is otherwise a criminal, illicit, profiteering political movement. But the fact of the matter is that has kept the alliance between the civilian and the military wings together, because everybody understands in the Chavista movement that they're in it together, and Maduro is their best source of defense. With Maduro, they will at least have a future more guaranteed than with the United States and with the opposition. So Maduro's in charge. I mean, he has survived. He is politically utterly dominant at the moment after last year's legislative elections. How do you get him to stand down? Well, I think you've got to look fundamentally at Chavismo itself. At some stage, he will stand down and he will be replaced. There will be a generational change. But forcing him out of power and holding Chavismo against the wall is not the way forward. I think if there is a relaxation of pressure, if there is an attempt to start real negotiations on the future of Venezuela with all sides, then at a certain moment, Maduro might just step down on his own. I don't think there is a secret formula. That said, the question about civil society is very relevant. It's very important for the EU to support civil society at this particularly dark moment in Venezuela, with a huge 80% collapse of the economy since 2013, with the exodus, with all these ongoing human rights violations. That support is absolutely essential to bring to light the challenges which people are facing, and to make sure that there is at least some possibility of redress in the future. And that brings me to the very important, very difficult issue of the International Criminal Court, potential full investigation into crimes against humanity in Venezuela. I can't dwell on that, but that's going to be an important event in this year, because it will obviously be either an issue which can be dealt with by the Venezuelan government, which will make efforts to bring in international monitoring to deal with its violations, or it will refuse any such cooperation with the ICC, and that will be a very difficult moment then for Venezuela. More just on COVID. Mexico. I want to say something particularly about Mexico. It's in the EU watch list. It's about the security situation there, which remains very serious. 35,000 people murdered last year. But Mexico's COVID pandemic is terrible. 160,000 dead, a severe undercount of the reality of the situation. A very important economic effect of COVID, and obviously the likelihood, as both the health effects and the economic effects continue without a mass vaccination campaign in place, that this will reinforce criminal organizations. We're already seeing, to a degree, this in Mexico. We're seeing in Colombia the very worrying effects of recruitment of young people, because schools remain closed in Colombia. They have remained closed since March of last year. 97% estimated of Latin American children have not been able to go to school in that time. And these are very worrying trends indeed. So I think that what the EU should be thinking of doing, obviously, the focus in the EU, Europe, and North America is one, domestic vaccination programs at the moment. But at a certain moment, when they are largely completed, or even before then, if possible, there is going to have to be support for Latin America to vaccinate, to support public health systems, and of course, to support the economies which have been very badly hit and will continue to be badly hit. And this is an ambitious program. But in the case of Mexico and Central America in particular, there's also got to be a focus on the security implications for what's gone on. Other countries in Latin America saw a big reduction in violence last year, and that includes the country I'm in, Colombia, which saw its lowest level of murders for 50 years last year, particularly in urban areas. But in Central America and Mexico, there wasn't nearly so much of a reduction. And as I said, the situation in Central America has been made worse by these two hurricanes of last year. And so I think it's important that the EU supports efforts, innovative efforts to change the approach towards these security problems. And alongside that supports the readoption of anti-corruption mechanisms and policies which were basically abandoned during the Trump years by Honduras and Guatemala, and to a degree by Mexico as well. So I think that's a pretty big agenda for the coming years.
Ivan, thank you very much. There's a lot covered in a short period of time. A little over 4 minutes though, so we are going to have to. Everyone else is going to have to be. I'm going to have to be stricter with you, otherwise we're not going to finish on time. But Ivan, thank you very much. Mark, could I turn to you to? There was a question on the Central African Republic, but also really anything you'd like to reflect on after the panel, the way you see the role of the FPI. Anything you'd like to reflect on that others said, how there was a question on supporting the critical women, peace and security agenda, and what the FPI is doing to do that. So please.
No, thanks very much, Richard. I think maybe before coming to some of the specific questions, let me briefly sort of just remind everybody that the background to this event and to our collaboration with International Crisis Group is really one of conflict prevention. It's in the nature of an event like this that we tend to look at crises that have already broken out or where things are already boiling up. But I think the essential part that we're trying to get to with this exercise and several other exercises that we're carrying out with other partners is for the EU to be able to engage in a preemptive way before conflicts become violent, ideally. And so let me, in that spirit, maybe come to some of the questions that were asked. I saw there was a question about whether the EES, the EU, is aware of how indigenous communities are currently struggling, not only indigenous communities, but communities overall, with the spread of extractive industries or the more aggressive approach of extractive industries under the guise of the COVID measures. Yes, we are aware of that. And I can tell you also how we are more and more aware of it, and that has a lot to do with the Kimberley process, where for the mining of diamonds, there's been over the last couple of decades by now, a civil society coalition brought about and working across the world in diamond producing countries, observing very closely how extractive industries are acting and looking to protect not only indigenous communities, but also artisanal miners. So indeed, we are aware of the particular situation that these communities are facing, and I expect that once COVID-19 will have subsided in importance, we will see a lot more of those effects, and we will need to develop strategies on how to address them. I also want to briefly come in on Fernando's point on gender and conflict, because he was referring to the root causes there. But it's not only in the root causes, but also in the response to conflict and in the prevention of conflict that gender plays an incredibly important role. We don't necessarily always look closely enough at the role that women and men play and how they are affected differently by conflict. One of the steps that we are currently taking to try and improve our own performance on that is to make sure that we systematically, every new activity that we start will go through sort of a diversity check, where we will look at how far have age, ethnicity, but also sex differences been taken properly into account in the design of the activity, to make sure that we can draw on the capacities and the strength of everyone to bring about peace. Let me very briefly then say also that, of course, in addition to the activities that we're carrying out through our crisis response funding, but also through our conflict prevention funding, which will continue in a very similar way as many of you have come accustomed to under the instrument contributed to stability and peace, there will, of course, now also be the European Peace Facility for work with military actors that is starting up, and that will certainly change the way that the EU can engage in the security and in the field of conflict prevention by taking a principled approach to working with the security sector in third countries. In the interest of time, I'll stop here. Thanks very much, Richard.
Mark, thank you very much. That was very, very comprehensive. Joost, let's turn to you if that's okay. So for you, we have this question on what can the EU mission, the IRINI, do to stop weapons getting into Libya? Is it about actually stopping, or is it more about reporting and raising awareness?
Well, I'd much rather that a EU official answer that question. But I would say that IRINI has been more effective at preventing weapons from arriving by sea than it has been in preventing weapons arriving by air, and I think that continues to be a serious problem until now. How exactly it would go about that, so I leave to colleagues. But I want to make a different point about Libya, which is that there was an important lesson that arose from the experience of 2011 and the military intervention that ousted Colonel Gaddafi, which is that if a military intervention takes place without any effort at state building, I'm not saying anything new here, it's just not enough. And now we see the results of the lack of a serious international investment in the post-regime order. And the thing is, if now no serious attempt is made to rectify that, then the problem will just fester, and the manifestations of which are the migrants coming through Libya and possibly refugees in the future, possibly jihadists and other issues that are important to Europe, they will continue. And so we need to go back, and I think my colleagues already mentioned it in Libya, and efforts are being made, but I cannot stress enough the importance of this, is that we need to get governing right in Libya. And of course, the first step is a ceasefire, and then the second step is an interim unity government, but it is unifying the parallel institutions that came out of the political crisis in 2014. So that must be an absolute top priority. One quick word on Iran as well. It is great if the United States and Iran can both sides can come back to the nuclear deal and reinstate it in full. But that is not going to restore everything that goes back 40 years to basically the crisis after the Islamic Revolution and the relations between the United States and Iran, or Iran would say since 1953 in the coup. But for that reason, it is really critical that there be an additional effort to try to address the longer term tensions in the Gulf. And that's where a Gulf-based dialogue encouraged by outside parties is so important. So it is not something that is something that we can do on the side in order to facilitate the nuclear talks. It is something that is needed for the longer term, beyond any kind of nuclear deal.
Joost, thank you very much. Rene, I'm going to turn to you. Perhaps not with specific questions, but would you like to reflect on anything that that others have said? Any other things that have struck you in the watch list or the discussion today?
That's the most difficult question of all of them. Thanks for that one, Richard. What can I say? I mean, it's clear that COVID has such an incredible impact that we really need to monitor that very closely. Of course, you've all heard about the Team Europe initiative, something like 30 billion euro, the EU and the member states to help all the countries affected. That's an important contribution, and it will never be enough. So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to help our colleagues in delegations, our geographical colleagues here in Brussels, with providing them with guidance on what should you be looking out for. So, for example, now we're looking at what are the economic implications of COVID, and how does that relate to the risk of conflict? COVID will not just be an unfortunate event, but it will really have very far-reaching implications, and I think we should all be very much aware of that and constantly adjust our toolbox in order to respond to this. There was a question about, do you do enough about conflict analysis? Well, we're actually in quite an exciting moment in that. I wish I had more time, then I could tell you a bit more about conflict analysis that we are doing and are about to do over the next couple of years in most of the fragile and conflict-affected countries. So that is really quite a change compared to the past, and we should find a moment to share some of that with you. There was a question as well about mediation and how are you going to follow up on your mediation concept. As you know, we had at the end of last year a new mediation concept was adopted by Council conclusions. How are you going to implement that now? Well, there will be a big launch event by the end of February on the so-called guidance note. So we have taken that new EU concept of mediation, which formulates as a concept what it is that we want to do in terms of mediation. We've taken all the critical elements out of that and translated that into a guidance note. And that is a guidance note for our heads of delegations, EUSRs, etc., and hopefully an inspiration for others, where we set out how we approach, I don't know, women, peace and security and mediation, climate change and mediation, the whole digital development and mediation. So all of that is forthcoming, and I hope we can share that with you soon and have an engagement on how to take that forward. Let me end on that positive note. Back to you, Richard.
Rene, thank you so much. Olia, I'm going to turn to you. There aren't specific questions for you, but would you like to reflect on anything else? We still have a question that I can come to, or that you can talk to about how Crisis Group, a really important question, how Crisis Group mainstreams our gender analysis, how we incorporate gender perspectives in our work. So you could talk about that one, or anything else that you would like to reflect on at the end.
Sure, and I'll try to do all of that quickly. So Crisis Group does come at our analysis from the standpoint that gender matters. We look specifically both at how narratives of masculinity, for instance, can affect conflict and how they can affect conflict resolution. Understanding that doesn't necessarily solve your conflict, right? I can tell you that narratives of toxic narratives of masculinity helped cause a war, but I can't magically solve it in order to end that war, right? So it does end up being much more of a understanding what's possible in resolution and prevention tool. We also do look at how conflicts affect people of different genders differently. And I think it is notable, and I recall the question that was asked, that this doesn't always come through in the conversations that we then have, right? Because we come back to these discussions of who can do what, how you can help prevent, how you can help mitigate. And a lot of the people at these, the tables for these discussions are going to be men. And I think that is a factor that you need to consider, and you need to also integrate into your work, whether you are thinking through ways to solve these problems or developing your own policies and solutions. I mean, I can say, talking about Ukraine, talking about Karabakh, talking about any of the conflicts in the region that I cover, gender is very important, and the impacts of these conflicts are very gendered. For instance, in Karabakh, most of the people killed were men. They were combatants, and they were also mostly young men because they were conscripts. Most of the people displaced were women and to some extent children. That's important in how you respond, how you design humanitarian support, and how you think about making peace in the future. The one other thing I would raise, and it does come back to COVID, because I think we're going to be thinking about the implications of this pandemic and perhaps future pandemics for a long time. Azerbaijan and Armenia estimate that between them, they lost something over 5,000 people killed in the 6 weeks of war. And that's probably about right. Those are mostly combatants. Both countries estimate that between them, they lost about 6,000 people to COVID over the past year. That's probably a stunning undercount. Here in Belgium, where I live, we estimate over 20,000 people have died from COVID. So when we think about our work and our desire to end conflict and our desire to keep people from being killed in conflict, we need to think about other things that kill people. And the implications of this pandemic, I think, are just huge here. I also think it's going to be really important to look at how great power competition plays out in vaccine distribution. I think there's going to be a lot of temptation both to use vaccine distribution for geostrategic aims, and potentially there's a risk that vaccine distribution might be blocked as a result of geostrategic conflict. And again, here we get to the question of who lives and who dies, which I think is very important for all of us.
Olia, thank you very much. Again, very thoughtful and comprehensive. Comfort, I'm going to leave you the last word of our panelists. I think you have an almost impossible task in that I'm going to ask you to answer the questions that have come up on Ethiopia. So one was, how should Europe's position factor in the influence of other powers, in essence, that also play a role in this, other global powers in particular. A word or two about the geopolitics of the crisis in Tigray. There's a question on Mozambique, so maybe you could just take one moment just to talk about what we're seeing happening in the Cabo Delgado area with the insurgency there. And then if you have a moment at the end to reflect on the Central African Republic, and obviously one of the other crises that really escalated towards the end of last year. It's in our watch list. We haven't talked about it much today, so if you could just end with a word on that too, that would be great. And I realize I'm being very greedy and asking you to do a lot in the in a short period of time. Thank you.
You said 4 minutes, right, Richard?
You have a little bit. You have a little bit longer. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Just to quickly sort of answer that sort of broader geopolitical questions, and I'll tie them up together. I mean, it's always worth remembering that the crisis, the Tigray crisis, is taking place, in a region that is also sort of an intense regional rivalry and great power geopolitics. With intense, rivalry over oil reserves. Sea route competition, not just in relation to China, but also Gulf rivalries, and also, I mean, I see one of your questions was in relation to China. But it's also not just China, Europe, but it's also China and the US as well. So it's a real contest for building up alliances as well. And in that mix, Ethiopia is a crucial actor in terms of Horn and Red Sea geopolitics as well. So I think, you know, there are three questions that have been asked here, and I'll leave aside the question of China, except to say that given China's own investment and the relationship in relation to debt, of course, you know, the way that relationship is unfolding with Ethiopia is interesting. I mean, Ethiopia has shown itself to be emboldened and independent and not necessarily hamstrung by the fact that it's got, you know, this great investment coming from China. It doesn't necessarily see that as binding its ability to independently pursue its own war in Eritrea. And in fact, Prime Minister Abiy is even more emboldened, seeing himself as securing a military victory. So I think the question is less about who's aligned to China, but how international actors can coalesce together to influence Abiy as well. And none of the international actors today, whether it's China, the Gulf countries, the Western countries, the EU, are able to nudge Prime Minister Abiy on the side. And I would frame the question around about building international consensus to try and pressure Prime Minister Abiy. Two, I think tied to that is the question of Eritrea. And in fact, Richard, it's not even a question about Eritrea. There's one key actor in all of this is an ally to the three countries. That's the UAE. The UAE influential in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, and in Sudan. All those three countries now face tensions both within themselves, between themselves, and the linchpin in all of this story is the UAE. So you've got an Eritrea where there's increasing evidence coming from the US, coming from eyewitnesses on the ground, is increasingly engaged, piling up evidence of its own involvement in the country. On the other side, you've got tensions escalating, border tensions with Khartoum and Addis playing out. And then the other layer then is tensions between Sudan and Egypt in relation to the GERD. And the question is how you begin to untangle and unpack all these tricky geopolitical dynamics to focus on the war in Tigray, to ensure that we don't see an unraveling of the crisis in Sudan, to ensure that we don't see an escalation of border tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia, and to also ensure that Eritrea doesn't feel further emboldened by the crisis in Ethiopia. What we're seeing today, Richard, is a strong standoff that is occurring between Ethiopia and Sudan. It's not quite clear who is going to be able to pull both forces back. One of the recommendations we make is that they take their border tensions to the AU Borders Boundary Commission to try and negotiate the tensions there as well. Moving swiftly to the question of Mozambique. The fact that we don't put Mozambique on any of our lists is not because we don't think it's important. I mean, in keeping with Crisis Group's own methodology, it's important for us to have done the groundwork, to have spoken to all the key actors before we place Mozambique on the country. In fact, it could have, and you and I debated whether to put Mozambique on the list, and we felt that it was a little bit premature to put it on. But we do recognize, and we are engaging with Mozambique within the context of our global work on jihadi and modern day conflict. I think, you know, crucial thing for us is that there are a number of lessons from the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, particularly the consequences of how disproportionate emphasis on military solutions themselves go hand in hand in worsening the situation on the ground. And one of the core recommendations to the Mozambique government is how to alter this reliance on a military response and try to seek more local political solutions, working for reconciliation with the different groupings and the insurgency, and to make sure that the insurgency doesn't mushroom to become sort of a 10-year crisis that, like we've seen in the Lake Chad Basin, or like we're seeing also in the Sahel. The one thing that I do know, Richard, because your Q&A person who asked the question asked about the EU's role. Under its 6-month presidency, we know that Portugal is trying to put on the table concrete options in which to deal with Mozambique. The foreign minister is supposed to be going down there to Mozambique. So I think we'll be looking out to see what recommendations Brussels will shape. But I think the key issue for us, lessons learned from the Sahel and Lake Chad Basin, is to ensure that we don't see further overuse of military force, that we don't see intercommunal violence, that we don't see a disproportionate use of force, and that there's real greater emphasis on political dialogue. Let me end by focusing on CAR, and it's, you know, in a sense, we've almost done what we've always wanted to avoid on CAR, which is to leave it right at the end and forget about it. It is a forgotten conflict, and the fact that it's back on the table, it's also very, very worrying. Just in a nutshell, Richard, you know, we've seen a significant setback in the Central African Republic, with opposition deeply unhappy, with no ability to change the dynamics on the ground. The government less likely to give concessions to the opposition. It's difficult to defeat the rebels. The government is relying and dependent on regional allies, plus Russian forces, plus the UN, to help stop the rebels from making any further inroads into Bangui. But also the rebellion is internally divided. Today, the Tudere seems safe. The government seems safe because the rebels can't take Bangui, and the rebels themselves can't keep hold of the key areas that they have. But getting the government and the opposition and the armed groups back to negotiations is essential. But with fighting continuing, it's hard to see how that's going to happen. I think before we can even begin to contemplate how to resurrect the 2019 peace agreement, several steps need to be taken beforehand. First, and I think the EU is in a strong position to persuade both sides to cool down the temperature and to begin to sort of pull back from the fighting. I think second, the EU is also in a strong position to get the opposition groups also to condemn the actions that took place before December, the elections. There's now clear evidence that there was an attempt to run on Bangui and to prevent those elections from taking place. And also, I think there has to be pressure on the government to pull back its use of security forces and pro-government militias into the country. All these are critical steps before we can begin to talk about how we can resurrect the 2019 election. So a lot of work to be done. I think one of our forecasts for 2019, for 2021, Richard, is that we're likely to see protracted conflict unfold in the CAR if we can't pull back the government forces and the rebels from the further fight in Bangui and other parts of the country. Thank you.
Comfort, thank you very much. That was brilliant as always. And you know, although we've left Central African Republic till the end, this time obviously we're watching very carefully. The team in Central Africa is really engaged on that conflict. Let me end by just making a very quick comment to something that Mark said, which I think is really important, that part of our partnership and our collaboration with the European Union is, of course, about early warning. It's about recognizing signs of problems early, mobilizing early action, and trying to steer off potential causes of violence, address potential causes of violence, avert crises. And a lot of this watch list work is aimed towards that. We also do a lot of other engagement. We obviously publish Crisis Watch, our monthly bulletin. We engage on the basis of that in horizon scanning with the EU institutions, which we enormously value. So just to reiterate what Mark said, you know, the importance of early warning, it's really a big part of our partnership with the European institutions. Let me end by wishing everybody a good evening if you're in Brussels, a good rest of the day if you're in the US, and thank you very much to Mark and to Rene that have joined us from the institutions. Thank you also to my colleagues Comfort, Olya, Ivan, Joost, and thank you everyone for joining us. Bye bye.